was a chilly November afternoon in Cincinnati, Ohio. J.D. Vance, the well-known senator and author, had just finished a meeting downtown and decided to take a walk instead of riding back to his office. The city was alive with movement, commuters rushing home, street vendors calling out their specials, and cars honking as the evening traffic built up. As he strolled past Fountain Square, something made him stop. There, sitting against the cold brick wall of the building, was a man huddled in a worn-out military jacket. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a cardboard sign that read, "Veteran in need, please help." His boots were tattered, his face was lined with exhaustion, and his eyes carried the weight of years of hardship. For a moment, J.D. simply observed him, watching as pedestrians passed by, barely sparing the man a glance. The senator had always spoken about the struggles of working-class Americans, but standing there, seeing this veteran abandoned on the streets, something stirred deep within him. He stepped forward, kneeling down slightly to meet the man's eyes. "Sir, what's your name?" J.D. asked, his voice calm but firm. The man looked up, started to limp. He hadn't expected anyone, let alone J.D. Vance, to stop and talk to him. After a moment of hesitation, he answered, David Reynolds." J.D. nodded. "David, were you in the military?" "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice rough from the cold. 10 years in the Marine Corps." J.D. felt a pang of frustration. How could someone who had served his country be left like this? He knew, right then and there, that he couldn't just walk away. J.D. Vance could see the hesitation in David Reynolds' eyes as he sat on the cold pavement, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. People continued to pass by, barely sparing them a glance. Yet J.D. stayed, his gaze steady. He could tell that David wasn't used to someone stopping, especially not someone like him. After a brief pause, David cleared his throat and spoke, his voice hoarse, likely from the cold and exhaustion. "I served in the Marine Corps for 10 years, he began. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. His words were slow, deliberate, as if each memory was something he had to carefully pull from a locked place in his mind. J.D. listened intently, nodding in encouragement. "What happened after you left the service?" he asked. David let out a sigh, his breath visible in the crisp November air. "Things were fine at first," he admitted. "I came home, got a job working construction. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough. I had an apartment, a car, even a dog named Rusty." A small, almost wistful smile flickered across his lips before disappearing. "Then, about 2 years ago, everything fell apart." He shifted uncomfortably before continuing, "I got hurt on the job. Nothing dramatic, just a bad fall. Messed up my back, and suddenly I couldn't do the heavy lifting anymore. The company let me go, and after that..." He paused, shaking his head. "You'd think, with my military background, finding another job wouldn't be so hard, but it was." J.D.'s jaw tightened. He had heard stories like this before, veterans struggling to adjust to civilian life, the promises of support often falling short. "Did you try the VA?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. David gave a bitter chuckle. "Of course. I applied for disability benefits, but the process takes forever. I kept getting the same response. 'We're reviewing your case.' Meanwhile, the bills kept piling up. I tried odd jobs, anything to keep the lights on, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, I lost my apartment." He looked down at his hands as if ashamed. "I stayed with a buddy for a while, but he had his own problems. Didn't want to be a burden, so I ended up out here." He gestured vaguely around him to the city streets that had become his home. J.D. could hear the quiet frustration in his voice, the exhaustion of a man who had fought for his country but was now fighting just to survive. He took a deep breath, trying to push back the anger building inside him, not at David, but at a system that allowed this to happen. "What about your family?" J.D. asked, keeping his tone gentle. David hesitated before answering. "My parents passed away a while ago. It's just me now." He paused, then added softly, I had a fiancée once, back when I first got out of the Marines, but when things got tough, she left. JD nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of David's words. You shouldn't have to go through this alone, he said firmly. David let out a small, disbelieving laugh. That's just how it is, isn't it? Guys like me, we come back, and if we're lucky, we land on our feet. If not, well, we end up like this. JD shook his head. It shouldn't be that way. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city buzzed around them, cars honking, people chattering, the occasional siren in the distance. But in that moment, JD wasn't thinking about politics or policy or speeches. He was thinking about the man sitting in front of him, about what needed to happen next. Finally, JD spoke with quiet determination. We're going to fix this, David. David blinked, as if not sure he had heard correctly. What? JD pulled out his phone. Stay right here. We're going to get you off this street. For the first time in a long time, David Reynolds saw something in another person's eyes that he hadn't seen in years. JD Vance didn't waste a second. He pulled out his phone, stepping a few feet away to make a call. The city buzzed around him, commuters rushing past, the scent of roasted nuts from a nearby street vendor filling the cold air. But his focus was entirely on getting David the help he needed now. Emily, JD said when his assistant picked up on the first ring, I need you to find a hotel nearby, someplace warm and decent. Make sure they have a room available immediately. Emily Carter, his longtime aide, didn't ask questions. She had worked with JD long enough to know that when he made a request like this, it was important. Got it, Senator. Anything else? Ispa's jaw tensed up, and JD glanced back at David, who was watching him with a cautious expression, as if not quite believing what was happening. Yeah, call a doctor, someone who can do a quick checkup tonight, and find a way to get a meal sent over. I don't want him waiting another hour in the cold. On it. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. JD hung up and turned back to David, crouching down so they were at eye level. Help is on the way, he said simply. David's brow furrowed. Why are you doing this? His tone wasn't ungrateful, just surprised. You don't even know me. JD met his gaze without hesitation. Because someone should have done it a long time ago. David didn't say anything, but JD could tell that answer meant something to him. A few minutes later, Emily called back. There's a room at the Oakwood Inn, about 5 blocks from where you are. I already booked it under your name, and I found a doctor who can meet him there in an hour. Good work, JD said. Send a car. Within minutes, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver, a well-dressed man with an earpiece, stepped out and opened the door. JD stood and held out a hand. Come on, David. We're getting you somewhere warm. David hesitated. He looked around as if trying to find a reason to say no. JD could see the internal struggle on his face, the years of being let down, of having to rely on himself, of not trusting that anyone was really there to help. JD didn't move. You don't have to do this alone anymore. That was it. The tension in David's shoulders loosened slightly. He reached out, gripping JD's hand, and allowed himself to be pulled to his feet. The ride to the Oakwood Inn was quiet. David sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, as if still trying to process what was happening. JD let him have that moment. When they arrived, the hotel manager, Mr. Callahan, was already waiting in the lobby, prepped by Emily. The man smiled warmly and extended a hand to David. Welcome, sir. We've got everything ready for you. David still seemed overwhelmed, but he followed Callahan inside, where a bellhop led them to a clean, comfortable suite. A warm bed, a hot shower, fresh clothes laid out on the dresser. JD saw the way David's eyes flickered over the space, taking it all in. A few minutes later, a knock at the door signaled the arrival of Dr. Mitchell, a local physician who had answered Emily's urgent request. He greeted them both and gestured toward the armchair. Let's have a quick checkup, shall we? JD stepped back, giving them space. He could hear the doctor asking David questions. "How long have you been out here? Any chronic pain? Are you eating regularly?" And David answering honestly for what was probably the first time in a long while. Meanwhile, JD picked up his phone again. There was still more to be done. He called Emily. "Reach out to Veterans Hope Foundation. Tell them we have a former Marine who needs immediate assistance with housing and employment." Emily responded immediately. "I already contacted them, Senator. A caseworker named Mike Henderson is on his way." JD smiled. "Good. And make sure his meals are covered for the week. I don't want him worrying about food." "Consider it done." As JD hung up, he turned back to see David finishing his checkup. Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. "You're in better shape than I expected, but you need proper rest and nutrition. I'm leaving you some vitamins and medication for joint pain." David accepted the small bag of prescriptions, murmuring a quiet, "Thanks, Doc." Then another knock. This time it was Mike Henderson, a friendly-looking man in his 40s wearing a jacket with the Veterans Hope Foundation logo. He stepped inside, took one look at David, and grinned. "Marine, huh? Semper Fi, brother." David blinked. "You served?" Mike nodded. "Army, 15 years, but I work with guys like you now, helping them get back on their feet." He pulled up a chair. "Let's talk about your future." JD watched as David's entire posture changed. Not just relief, but a glimpse of hope. This wasn't just about one night in a warm bed. This was a new beginning. As David sat across from Mike Henderson, the caseworker from Veterans Hope Foundation, JD Vance watched closely, sensing that this was the most important moment of the night. Getting David off the streets had been the first step, but what really mattered now was ensuring that he had a sustainable path forward. Not just a temporary reprieve, but a real chance at rebuilding his life. Mike leaned forward, his posture open and relaxed, but his tone was firm. "Look, brother, I've worked with a lot of guys in your position. I know what it's like to feel like you're on your own. But I promise you, you're not. We have programs to help you, and I'm going to make sure you get what you need." David still looked wary, but there was a slight shift in his expression. For the first time, someone wasn't just offering him a meal or a one-night stay, they were offering him a future. JD took a seat beside them. "David, we're going to take this one step at a time," he said. "First, let's get you stable. Housing, food, medical care. Then we'll work on getting you back on your feet." Mike nodded. "We have transitional housing available. It's not just a shelter, it's a place where veterans like you can stay while we help you get a steady job and a permanent home. Would you be open to that?" David hesitated. "I don't want to take a handout," he muttered, his voice low. Mike's smile didn't waver. "This isn't a handout, it's a hand up. You served your country, now it's our turn to serve you." JD watched as David processed those words. He had seen that look before. The battle between pride and survival, between accepting help and feeling like you failed. It was a struggle that many veterans faced. After a long pause, David finally exhaled and gave a small nod. "All right, I'll do it." Mike clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "Good. That's the first step. Tomorrow morning, I'll take you to the facility, get you settled in. It's a solid program. We help you get identification, job placement, and we even have counseling for PTSD if you need it." JD chimed in. "And I've already arranged for your first 6 months of rent to be covered once you transition to permanent housing. You don't have to worry about that." David's eyes widened. You really don't have to do that?" JD shook his head. "I know I don't. But I want to." David looked away for a moment, blinking rapidly, as if trying to hold back emotions he wasn't used to showing. I don't know what to say." Mike grinned. "You don't have to say anything yet, man. Just focus on moving forward." A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. It was room service. A staff member wheeled in a tray with a hot meal, steak, mashed potatoes, and a side of vegetables. The aroma filled the room, and David's stomach audibly growled. JD smirked. Go ahead, you've earned it. David hesitated for only a second before digging in. He ate slowly at first, almost as if savoring each bite, then with more confidence. JD watched as some of the tension in David's face began to fade, replaced by something else. Maybe relief? Maybe something even deeper. As David ate, Mike continued explaining the next steps. We'll also get you enrolled in a job training program. What kind of work would you be interested in? David wiped his mouth and thought for a moment. I used to work construction before my back injury. I can still do some light labor, but nothing heavy. Mike nodded. That's good to know. We have partnerships with a lot of companies that hire veterans, and if you're interested, we can also look into trade programs. Things like electrical work, IT certifications, even security jobs. David looked surprised. You guys do all that? We do. And we'll stick with you every step of the way. JD saw something change in David's posture. The hunched, guarded stance was starting to relax, replaced by a small but undeniable sense of hope. The conversation continued for another hour, going over all the details. Medical care, legal assistance, transportation help. Every concern David brought up, Mike had a solution for. Finally, as the night wound down, JD stood up. All right, David, you have a plan, you have support. Now all you have to do is take the next step. David looked at JD, his eyes filled with an emotion that words couldn't quite capture. I don't know how to thank you. JD smiled. You don't have to. Just promise me one thing. David tilted his head. What's that? JD extended his hand. When you get back on your feet, pay it forward. David stared at him for a long moment, then shook JD's hand firmly. I will. JD nodded, satisfied. For the first time in a long while, David Reynolds had something he hadn't had in years. A future. The next morning, as the first light of dawn streamed through the hotel window, David Reynolds woke up in a real bed for the first time in months. For a moment he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting it all sink in. The warmth of the blanket, the clean clothes folded neatly beside him, the simple fact that he had slept through the night without the biting wind cutting through his bones. It was overwhelming. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mike Henderson had arrived to take him to the Veterans Hope Foundation's transitional housing. It wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a stepping stone to something more. As they walked out of the hotel lobby, David turned to see J.D. Vance waiting for him by the entrance. J.D. extended his hand and David shook it firmly. You're going to do great things, David, J.D. said with quiet confidence. David exhaled, standing a little taller. I won't waste this chance. J.D. smiled. Just remember what we talked about. When you're back on your feet, find someone else who needs help. Pay it forward. David nodded. I promise. As J.D. watched David step into the SUV, ready to start a new chapter of his life, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. One life had been changed. It wasn't a policy debate, a bill in Congress, or a speech. It was a simple act of kindness, a decision to stop, listen, and take action. And it had made all the difference. This story isn't just about J.D. Vance or David Reynolds. It's about the thousands of veterans across America who face similar struggles every day. Many who have served their country find themselves forgotten, struggling to adjust to civilian life, battling homelessness and job insecurity. But change is possible, and it often starts with just one person deciding to make a difference. What can we learn? A small act of kindness can change a life. Veterans deserve our respect and support beyond just words. If you have the ability to help someone, don't hesitate. Step up. Your voice matters. Now we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you know someone who has struggled after military service? What can we as a community do to support our veterans better? Leave a comment below and let's start a conversation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. Together, we can make a difference.